Birching hat.
Get that.
Okay. As I did before, all I have to do is screen share. So, okay, it says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
I made you co-host.
Okay. Then how am I supposed to
Oh,
be?
I'm sorry, you're logged in twice?
I didn't think so, but
Oh, I'm sorry, it's my mistake. Let's try this again.
you want me to hit screen share again?
Yeah, you'll have to.
Okay, here we go. Okay, and then we'll go to slideshow and go to current slide. Come on, slideshow. There we are. Okay. I think we're there. We did this without a catastrophe, at least so far. Can everyone in Zoom land hear me? I don't know if there's,
Yes.
I got a nod. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. All right, so the real question here is, again, not a matter of looking at fault, but to look at the significance of Ukraine, both from the standpoint of the United States and from the standpoint of the global commons. In order to have us on roughly the same page, I've prepared, as I did last time, a few points of interest that partly cover the history, but also are just launching points for some of our discussion. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to do this, but I do need to get my slides up. And here we go. Now, for some reason, it bounces back. I don't know why. Okay. It'll be what it'll be. I'll go here. There. I don't know if you can see that. Good, you can't. All right, as I talked about before, I have my rules. I don't want crosstalk. Address your comments here, I'll bounce them back. If you can't hear the question, please let me know immediately. Otherwise, if I end up just repeating questions, it'll be an issue of, everybody just spending a lot of time trying to figure out what I just said. Can you hear me all right with this microphone? Okay, great. It's not designed to solve the conflict. I want everyone to feel comfortable participating. Even if you think you don't know much about this, these questions are going to be somewhat generic, as they were last time. So it's an idea that you keep in mind as we go forward. And there's a little subtle extra objective to it, which is, as we look at what our representatives are doing, do we understand what they're trying to accomplish? Do we think they understand what they're trying to accomplish? Not as a judgment in any particular person or administration, because this goes way back in many areas, but more particularly to make us focus on certain essential elements, excuse me, that are critical to how we behave as a society, and especially with the upcoming elections, not just the one that's going to take place on Tuesday, but in 2026, 2028, and beyond. So, deepen our understanding of national interests and national security. We're going to talk about that in somewhat general terms, but I believe it's very important when we come to talking about this particular conflict. What are the role of transnational organizations like the UN? But there are a myriad of other transnational organizations. How do they participate? Another one, NATO, just as an example. What are the objectives of nations which support either side? I'm not talking about Russia and Ukraine and what they want. I'm going to cover that briefly. But we're talking about why would China and North Korea support Russia against Ukraine? Conversely, why would Hungary or Poland be less interested in supporting Ukraine than might appear to be the case otherwise? And again, some of this is going to be, I hope, illuminating. And then, in a sense, how much the United States should commit. And this runs through a lot of different dynamics than just how much money. You'll notice I didn't say how much financial assistance. This goes much deeper than that. All right. So here again is just a redefinition of the considerations, and then we'll come back to this as we go on. But I wanted to emphasize the point that all wars end with a political solution, even unconditional surrender. Because ultimately, in the modern era, we sign treaties. And those of you who've come to the lectures on American colonial history have been hearing a little bit about that and why that's important. So we keep these in mind. What's the role of countries in Europe? What's the threat to national security? And so on and so forth. So you can see this, and I think it outlines some of the critical elements that we may address as we go forward. Now, I'm going to cover a little bit of history just so that we're all dealing with the same exposure, if you will. That doesn't mean you don't bring in your own stuff. But here's an example of what the US is committed roughly up to the end of this year. Now, the block on the far right, where it says allocated other support, is infrastructure support and a bunch of other initiatives that go on. So it's pretty easy to look at military and economic and humanitarian, but there's a whole other category of stuff that never really gets talked about. And yet, look at the depth of the commitment. All right? Now, is there anyone here who remembers that old phrase that used to be said, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money? Some of us are old enough to remember that. Exactly. So here we're talking about multiples of billions. Okay? So we have to ask ourselves, yes?
Could you please read the titles of the Excel?
All right, down at the bottom, this first one is military and security, blue being what's been delivered. And the other color, I'll call it yellow because I don't have the nuances, is what's promised, if you will. Economic and direct budget support, humanitarian, and then other support, the other being a big category. Okay? All right. We're going to cover some of these documents and events because it's important in part to understand how this conflict came about and understand how this relates to the responses of the rest of the world to what's going on. Now, there's a simple historical analogy that fits in. Some of you may remember from other lectures or your own knowledge that under the League of Nations, Ethiopia was attacked by Italy. and Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations begging for support and to find a way to stop Italy from doing what they were doing. What was the consequence of his address to the League? Nada.
Nothing.
Exactly. Okay? So keep these things in mind as we move forward, because global engagement has been a little tighter in this situation, but it still has not crossed a particular threshold that we'll talk about a little later. So Ukraine gets independent with the collapse of the Soviet Union, embraces all territory, including 24 oblasts. Those are like provinces or states. That's the Russian term. And it includes the Crimea, which Khrushchev had actually given to Ukraine during his administration running the USSR. But what's important about Ukraine? Sebastopol, the major naval base for the USSR Black Sea Fleet. Russia looks at this and says, wait a minute, that fleet's ours. And how can we have a naval base in a separate country? So that's already a problem because each side claimed control. What we don't remember is that it was under joint control up until 1997, when they arranged the partition treaty, and Russia received about 80% of the fleet, Ukraine received the remaining 20%, and Russia agreed to lease Sebastopol for 20 years, and then that was extended. And they agreed to non-interference. Now, we're not getting further into details of who's got what ships and capabilities and so on. In addition, Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Something, again, most of us didn't remember because we kept thinking the Russian Federation had all the nuclear weapons. No, Ukraine had them. So different agreements were to be reached, which had to do with the limitation on nuclear weapons, the verification of measures to control those nuclear weapons with inspections and monitoring, and that Ukraine would join the non-proliferation treaty. But it took 2 years before everything could be put in train to remove those nuclear weapons from Ukraine. And some of you may remember the dialogues that went on, who's going to get what, how are we going to be sure these missiles are destroyed or dismantled, who gets the uranium and all the rest of it. Became a very complex topic. But in that Budapest memorandum, they agreed to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, existing borders, refrain from the threat or use of force, avoid economic coercion, and go to the UN Security Council if Ukraine became a victim of aggression. Now, it's an interesting element to remember the Constitution of the, small c, the Constitution of the UN Security Council. Once the USSR broke up, who took the place of the USSR on the Security Council? Russia, okay? Keep that in mind. It was turned over to them. Nuclear commitments on transfer finally concluded in '96. Now, jumping further ahead, we had the following event. February 2014, Yanukovych, who had been somewhat pro-Russian, had to flee the country under this Euromaidan revolt or mass protest. It's unclear just how much, not whether or not, but how much the US participated. There's no question that we participated. So Yanukovych leaves, and he's replaced by a more Western-oriented administration. And this sets up a little different dynamic between Russia and Ukraine, because Yanukovych had been more their associate. I won't call him necessarily an ally, and I wouldn't call him a puppet, although we may want to use that term, but I don't think that is where we're going. And then, February 27, over the course of a month, Crimea is taken over by the Little Green Men. Now, the population of Crimea at that time was roughly 99% Russian ethnicity or Russian language dominant. So keep that in mind as well. Then, soon after they have landed, they organize a referendum, and within a short time, they actually annex Crimea. This is a formal move on the part of the Russians to say this land is our land, okay? From the Black Sea coastal to the Sea of Azov. No, I'm sorry. Okay. What happens soon afterward is the separatist movement escalates on the eastern border of Ukraine. This is what happens. The separatist group is pro-Russian. And remember, if you can, that much of eastern Ukraine has Russian ethnicity in it, as well as Russian language. Now, that doesn't mean that those people didn't think of themselves as Ukrainian. But what I'm talking about is the differences which highlighted why Russia behaved the way it did. And I'm not excusing their behavior. I'm coming to an understanding of why they did what they did. And one of the things that Putin was concerned about was that the Russians in Ukraine would be treated as second-class citizens. Well, this sounds a little bit like Germany and exactly the Sudetenland. So exactly what happened to Czechoslovakia is there's now this rim, this crust around the eastern border of Ukraine where Russia says those are our people and you can't mistreat them. And this separatist movement starts, almost certainly initially with Russian encouragement, and then with overt Russian support. There was always a question as how many little green men were actually involved in the separatist groups fighting against the Ukrainian army. But as this developed over time, the idea was that this conflict that you see erupting was going to have a substantial effect on how each country tried to navigate the following years. Agreements were drawn up. Minsk I was in September of 2014 and fell apart almost immediately. So another accord was mentioned. Now I bring this up because there are references that you may hear even today, particularly from the Russian side, about this accord and the agreements that were reached on it. Ceasefire in Donetsk and Luhansk, or Lugansk, it depends on how good your Russian is. Withdrawal of heavy weapons, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, will monitor it. Now notice that Russia at this time signs this with Ukraine, that they're willing to have a separate group come in and monitor it. The dialogue on local elections, how do you have a fair election? Who decides who's allowed to vote? In this particular idea of who's going to be in charge there. Pardon and amnesty, release and exchange, the all for all. However many we have, we'll give them back to you. However many you have, you give them back to us. And deliver of humanitarian aid. All sounds very good. And it sounds like a very plausible outcome with the following other stipulations. Restoration of social economic links, Ukrainian control of the state border after local elections. It's an interesting nuance there that we'll highlight perhaps a little bit later. Withdrawal of all foreign armed formations with military equipment, mercenaries, which Russia was using to help assist the separatists. You may have heard of the Wagner Group, just as an example. Constitutional reform. Oh, this gets interesting. Decentralization. Special status. What does that mean? Anybody? Are they going to be autonomous? Are they going to have their own foreign relations? What does that really mean as a special status? And like our discussion on Gaza, you can have these terms laid out, but to make it real on the ground requires building the vehicle from the ground up. Nuts and bolts is what we often talk about. The local elections, okay, they'll be, according to Ukrainian law, monitored by OSCE. And then this trilateral contact group in order to see that the thing is implemented. Does it hold up? No. There are a variety of reasons why it falls apart. Now, if you receive this recording, I ask you to go to this site and look this up. It's fascinating. It's filled with a number of historical truths and a number of what I interpret as untruths, or at least distortions, in such a way that I could question the veracity of much of it. But the point is, this is Putin's manifesto. He laid this out in front of everybody as a publication. And if you haven't read it, then it becomes difficult to understand what's happening in Ukraine and Russia literally up to today. Now, what's been the cost? Numbers are, as usual, all over the place, and there's no way to verify it, all right? Just no way. But the best estimates are things like this: 14,000 deaths, including civilians. This is to Ukraine in good measure. 1.6 million internally displaced. So what this means is that for the separatist fighting, as many as 14,000 were killed and 1.6 million displaced. The economic losses were enormous, particularly to Ukraine, and it's just broken down to equipment and material losses. Now, as of 2022, the Russian GDP losses were listed at that number of 103 to 160 billion, 6 to 9% of GDP. But interestingly, since 2022 up to now, Russian GDP has been growing. That's interesting. Mid-2022, you can see the financial capital losses are amazingly deep, and yet somehow, despite these enormous costs, Russia remains completely engaged in this conflict. The casualties here now, up to October, best estimates I can find, killed and wounded over 1 million, some independent estimates, maybe 300,000 in 2025 alone. You'll hear Trump say 7,000 a week, right? And all you have to do is kind of multiply that by how many weeks, and you'll begin to see where that comes from. Believe it or not, it's up to you. Daily losses are listed there. Breakdown by year. You'll see how it's running at a fairly substantial level of casualties. Civilian losses, hard to identify. Now, these are Russian civilians. We're going to come to things because it's also true for Ukraine. We really don't know. How has Russia responded? They've increased their conscription cycles, bringing in more and more people. They took away the idea that conscripts aren't to be sent to combat zones, and they got around that idea by saying, well, you can sign a contract for extra money, and then we can send you to Ukraine. And then they also showed, as you hear, reserve expansion, so that you can have these people in reserve being trained, get them up to snuff. Foreign recruitment. Cuba. Now, I haven't seen anything specific about the number of Cubans, but I have seen estimates on the number of North Koreans. And that's another interesting dynamic that we could talk about. But also look at the growth of their military overall. In 3 years, they've gone up to another 50%. Now, have there been effects elsewhere? And I think there's a little screw up in the slides we'll come to. Africa, Russia taps into the gratitude that it's had in its struggles in helping them against colonialism. But they're also feeling the effect from the loss of food. Latin and South America, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, right there with Moscow, okay? Military cooperation, disinformation, whatever that really means, worsening inflation, and so on. Peace initiatives by Mexico and Brazil favor Russia. Now, I didn't get into the depths of that because we're going to talk a little bit about that later. How about the Arab countries? Boosted oil and natural gas prices. Good for us. Hurts Jordan, Egypt, and Tunisia because they have to import. Middle Eastern, North African countries dependent on exports of grain and food. So they're under some pressure to see this conflict come to an end so Ukraine's grain exports can be resumed. There was an agreement just, I think, a year ago, no more than 18 months, that was to allow more grain exports out of Ukraine, but that hasn't worked out awfully well. And Russia itself has responded by increasing its production and export of weapons. And Iran has gained politically because they've been sending things to Russia. That helps their economy. And that way, Moscow has cooperated in military intelligence and technology. And the same has been true with Russia and North Korea. Been some interesting develops. Now, when you hear about all the casualties, there are two things to keep in mind that are of great importance to how we're going to finish up this presentation and start the open discussion. Russia's demographic crisis, and actually this is something that's almost occurring globally right now. Population 145 million, projected to drop in just 3 years. Those numbers don't look terrible, 1.5 million, but it's the downward trend which has been going on. You look at the fertility rate, 1.5 births with replacement at 2.1. That's really troubling. And the median age has gone up to 40. Now, what about Ukraine? Again, the numbers are really more speculative than something we can count on, but at least we have an idea. So you look, different numbers, 100,000 killed, and then you say, well, the official estimate, the end of last year, 43,000 killed. Look at the estimates from Western intelligence, 60 to 100,000 killed, 400,000 casualties, civilian casualties, tens of thousands. None of this takes into account the roughly 4 million Ukrainians who left Ukraine with the onset of this particular conflict. So Ukraine is facing certain problems: mobilization, public resistance when your country's been invaded, draft evasion, training, registering, territorial recruitment offices. Several of those were actually targeted by the Russians to be destroyed so that there wouldn't be a place where people could go to sign up. I don't think it was very effective, but the message was, don't go there to sign up. Manpower shortages, you'll see here, frontline units overstretched. Legislative response, penalize draft evasion, streamline mobilization, but the Parliament has been reluctant to lower the draft age, which is rather surprising, given the threats they're under. And the strategic strain that they have struggled with and are continuing to struggle with right up to this day. Their demographic crisis is every bit as difficult as the Russians. But notice the population, 41 million down to about 39. Represents a 5% drop. That's a lot. Births, even worse than Russia. Initially in 2022, 0.9, when the normal should be 2.1. But now they've come up at least to 1.5. The median age distribution is comparable to Russia's. But you begin to see that this is a real problem for them to keep in the fight. Now, I'm going to touch on a few of these things. We're almost to the end of the slides. And then we're going to go back to those questions. Putin has laid out the following demands as of this year. No NATO, no Western troops, the Donbass region, Donetsk, Luhansk, or Lugansk, depending on what you like, have to be left under Russian control. And that actually includes that complete land bridge to the Perekov Isthmus, which leads into the Crimea. Because the only access that Russia had to the Crimea prior to the conflict was over the railway and road bridge that went from the Kuban to the eastern shore of the Crimea. That was the only route they had. And now they have a land route which is much more secure. Notice this recognition over occupied regions, and Ukraine formally cedes 4 regions Moscow annexed in 2022. Even though Russia doesn't control them. Freeze on the current front lines, which in a sense says, we're keeping what we got, we'll let you keep what you've got. Withdrawal from minor gains, Russia may be willing to withdraw. They've been closing in on Kharkiv and a couple other important locations. Pokrovsk is one, Kherson is another, where they're beginning to make some some claims to advance. There are a couple others. Kiev or Odessa, okay, you can keep those. Martial law, which is currently present in Ukraine. Remember, with declaring martial law, Zelensky has put aside elections, okay, which led to some difficulties because Putin at one point said, I can't talk to Zelensky because he's not the appropriately legally elected president of Ukraine, so I can't talk to him. It's a little bit like Lincoln not talking to Jefferson Davis, right? I can't recognize you as the president of the Confederacy because I create legitimacy to you being a confederacy. And I changed this from a rebellion to an invasion. So it's an interesting element of how legality fits in. Protect the rights of Russian speakers. In addition, notice churches.
Have fun.
Zelensky shut down Russian Orthodox churches because he felt they were subverting the Ukrainian defense. And there's probably some legitimacy to that claim, but you have to recognize that part of the reason for that separatist movement had to do with the Russian people who were there ethnically and Russian speakers, and how this all began to rise, and remove sanctions, including gas transit. Where does the gas go? From Russia where? Europe, particularly Germany, right? Which means billions of dollars. Now remember that Nord Stream, which was through the Baltic, was blown up in order to prevent the transfer of oil and gas to Europe from Russia. And it's still uncertain who did it, but evidence has come up that strongly suggests that the Ukrainians did it. How about Zelensky's aims? No territorial concessions. Ceasefire first, then we'll talk. Well, we've heard that with Gaza. They said, you have to have a ceasefire before we'll talk to you. Israel said, not going to happen. Security and reconstruction, Western security guarantees, international tribunal support, notice this, prosecuting Russian war crimes. Our administration, around the time this conflict started calling Putin a war criminal. Now, if you're Putin, what does that mean to you personally? And what does that mean to how you're going to negotiate with anybody? Is that going to help you? Is that going to be a threat that you're going to say, oh, I'm so sorry, yeah, I'll turn myself over? Or when it was strongly hinted that we, as the United States, were looking for regime change. Now, think about that. You're Putin, that's another threat. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be brought before the Hague in the International Court and condemned and put in prison. The hint is, take him out. Who's going to take him out? Other people within the Russian government. And if you make that statement, does that mean you're going to assist those who are trying to take him out? It's an interesting perspective, but that's what they were dealing with. NATO membership still on the table. Now, interestingly, not too long ago, Putin said joining the EU would be more acceptable, but not NATO. And there are specific reasons for that. So what happened recently? Trump meets with Zelensky. He was supposed to meet with Putin. Putin has been an SOB from Trump's standpoint, in spite of their so-called good relations and willingness to talk. But he finally said, we're supposed to meet in Budapest. I'm not going to go. Screw it. The guy just isn't reliable. But when he meets with Zelensky, here are the critical things. We'll support a ceasefire, but he does not agree with the other Putin demand that Ukraine cede territory in Donetsk and Lugansk. But saying that is a little bit of a distortion, because in order to get a resolution of the conflict, it also says indirectly, well, maybe you got to give up territory. Now, the Kremlin, as we've said, has these issues with the following that has been said before: establish a new order in Ukraine. Putin's used the term denazification, whatever that's supposed to mean. If we apply that in our country, it means half the country goes away, right, according to one side. So I'm not quite sure what that means. But what is really important is Russia needs security guarantees. Now, Greg, you made a very interesting comment about that. I'd like you to address that right now. Do you remember what you wrote to me?
I have a copy right here, but I'm not sure how it
Can we
fits
turn the
in.
light on? Would that help? Would you go up to the lectern?
For those of you who've attended some of the history lectures that have been done, some of this will sound familiar. For those of you who haven't or have forgotten, as I often have, oh, for Christmas sakes. Go ahead, Greg, it's all yours. Let me see if I can get this light for you. Okay.
You want to give my
You're dealing with why would Russia want security guarantees? Okay. You started right here.
Okay. In 1940, the Soviet Union displayed conventional military weakness against Finland. Russia has again indicated military incompetence against Ukraine. But in World War II, Russia demonstrated amazing resilience against Nazi Germany. Russia perceives the westernization of Ukraine as an existential threat. So Russia will continue to stop that. Even though Russia has demonstrated conventional and military incompetence, they are a capable nuclear threat by air, land, and sea. Is mutual assured destruction sufficient to deter Russia from using their nukes? This is all under how dangerous is Russia
Right.
to the West.
Okay.
And I say very dangerous.
Okay.
Russia continues to display the ability and the will to assassinate its perceived enemies in Western countries. I say dangerous. They're a dangerous country.
Okay, thanks. Okay. But I wanted you to hear that because Russia's history in terms of dealing with the West has been, it's been invaded numerous times. Now, Trump's particular attempt to try to sort this out, I've listed very quickly here, direct negotiations, he thought that was always best. If you can talk to your enemies, maybe you can figure out a path to a resolution. If you don't talk to them, what have you got left? You have to force them unwillingly to accede to whatever it is you wish. And remember that first opening part. Every conflict ends with a political solution, even unconditional surrender. Mixed signals, he's not going to send tomahawks. Victory fund. Well, he's trying to find a way to cut off Russia economically by using tariffs against countries that are importing Russian fuel and gas. Jesus, for sakes. I'll go throw this thing out. And including India, which is another site. Ceasefire versus a peace deal. Hey, if you can both say we won, why not? You may remember when George McGovern was running against Nixon, one of the bitter elements in the campaign was the Vietnam War. McGovern said, let's just say we won and leave. I'm sorry? That was George Aiken of Vermont. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, thank you for that. And then security guarantees. Real issue about Ukraine joining NATO. Now, what about the European Union? Now we're beginning to get other countries trying to weigh in on how to solve this problem. Ukraine sovereignty, all right, Ukraine leads the peace process. Does that mean you embrace Zelensky's aims completely? That's a little bit of a question. Territorial integrity. All right, whatever remains to Ukraine is governed totally by Kiev, but does that mean all lands under the 2022 political arrangement remain with Ukraine? Ceasefire first, military financial aid, security guarantees, and then opposition to territorial concessions. How legitimate is that likely to be for Putin, who's had 1 million casualties plus, enormous expenditure, great difficulties with the economy, although it's recovering, and that's temporary because it's a war-related economy, and he's supposed to walk away with nothing? Is that realistic?
What did he get in Afghanistan?
Well, this is what I want to use as an example, because the difference there is 5,000 miles as opposed to on your border, okay? And what's happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places where we got ourselves embroiled in a conflict and walked away, what happened? What were the repercussions? Now, Hungary, as I mentioned, is an outlier. Orban has been criticized as a Hungarian Nazi by some in our media, basically. And he's received a lot of criticism from his EU partners because he's seeing this conflict in a different context and one that relates particularly to his country, which has a lot of refugees in it. And he wants them out of there. They cost him a lot. And that's true with Poland as well. So now I'm going to open the floor up to discussion. Sorry about taking more time than I anticipated. But I want to put this question out first and foremost. Why should we in the United States consider Ukraine important at all? What strategic interest of ours is embraced in Ukraine? Now let's go back to one other point, and then it's wide open. Back during the Obama administration, Ukraine was understood to be the most corrupt European country in that continent. And you may recall that things got so out of hand that then Vice President Biden went to Ukraine and basically told the government, you must stop investigating Burisma or we're not going to give you the $1 billion that we have promised you as aid. Because he was concerned about the corruption within their Department of Justice and how they were going to target certain entities. In his own words, sure enough, they fired the prosecutor. So, anybody, does the United States have a strategic interest in Ukraine? And if it does, what is it? Yes.
Well, they already got what I wanted, I think.
Wait a minute, we got one thing to do. Microphone? Yeah, we found this happen before. So what we're going to do is ask you to speak into the microphone. You don't have to tell us your name and address.
No, the piece that really this country wanted was access to the minerals. But I think that Trump negotiated part of that already.
Well, that's this administration.
Yeah.
But remember, this conflict started in a previous administration.
That's
Back
right.
then, what was our strategic interest? Did we have enough economic tie to Ukraine that we needed their minerals? Or were we getting them from somewhere else? It's a question.
We were getting them from China.
Yes.
We were getting them from China, not not our friend.
Okay,
We had hints that rare earth minerals were available, even in the United States, maybe in California.
right,
We knew then that there were rare earth minerals in Ukraine.
yes,
And a free Ukraine that didn't have its rare earth minerals territory ceded to Russia was a potential source for rare earth minerals for us.
right.
So even then, access to rare earth minerals would be a strategic interest of ours.
Right.
And I had other things here too.
Okay, we want to share this. Yes,
Well, aside from the mineral financial, I think one of the core strategic issues is since World War II, we have established an international legal order, if you will. And many studies have shown that we are actually relatively peaceful as far as how many casualties is happening in the world versus World War I, World War II. And since World War II, one of the key reasons for that is because major states are not invading to take territory because of the international legal order. And I think it's one of the key features to be considered. I don't, getting back to you, as you've made it clear, you're not trying to advocate a particular resolution, but it's something that weighs on the entire situation.
two quick responses. One is that I think it's in the spring, there's going to be another discussion group like this on the United Nations. You were referring to that in good part. But now I'll ask you, this is a way of looking at it. Rwanda. Okay. Did the international order do anything about that? How about Sudan? International order do anything about that?
No.
No.
Darfur.
So, yeah, exactly. Darfur is part of that matrix. And Libya, which has undergone a whole lot of terrible effects from the collapse of the Gaddafi government and breakup there. Somalia, which has evolved into a failed state. So some of those cross borders, some of those don't. But when we talk about effectiveness, then the other key question is Gaza and Israel. So in terms of things, no, I don't want to make it an argument. I want to just look at strategic interests. The United States, yeah, it receives some trade with Ukraine, but it was never a big part of our economic order. So if it becomes a moral issue, that takes it into a whole different arena, you see?
Well, if I could just,
Go ahead.
maintaining perspective, as you say, the illustrations you've pointed out are a country being invaded, struck. One of the factors, which you picked the most complex world situation to discuss, which is interesting, but what's also in evaluating the importance of Ukraine is the expressed interest of the adjoining NATO countries, and where Putin has expressed a desire to reconstitute the original Soviet environment. So it's a different, you can say Darfur, it's not Ukraine and then we're done.
Right.
So,
Good points. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Cold War is over, but most of us are old enough to remember when Khrushchev banged his shoe on the table and said, "We will bury you." And I think that's perhaps the motivation to not allow this to happen.
Okay. And I think that those are good points. Yes. Of course.
I correspond online with about five Chinese professors. And as one of the things they say emotionally is that they are scared to death of the United States declaring war on China.
Okay.
And another thing that they say is that they're supportive of Russia in regard to Ukraine and NATO because they see them as an existential threat to Russia, a very serious existential threat to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So they, therefore, as Chinese individuals, not as the government or anything like that, but these are real people that I talk with a lot, or frequently. They can't seem to bring themselves to see Russia as the bad guy in this thing.
We're going to talk about China in 2 weeks, just
Thank
so that, but keep that thread, right? Because that's an important consideration 2 weeks from now. But it does relate to why would a country like China or North Korea support Russia? And again, I think your point is an excellent one. Robert, you were going to raise a question?
Yeah.
Can we give him the?
I was going to echo the point that Putin is trying to reconstruct the old Soviet Union, and that Tajikistan and Georgia and are in danger as well. U.S. plays a major role in NATO, and Russia appears to have designs on the Baltic states again, because that was part of their sphere of influence. If they go into the Baltic states, that's an aggressive action that is going to call on us to provide warlike support. The other point is, anytime there's a major mess up in Europe, the US eventually gets involved. We had nothing to do with the killing of the Archduke in Sarajevo and in Chamberlain's concessions, but eventually we became strongly integrated, and it was because of us that both wars were effectively run. So eventually we get into it, and it would behoove us to be there at the beginning to try to make sure that the conflagration does not occur that requires our participation.
Okay.
I would like to add one more peripheral point.
Okay.
Ukraine is a relatively recent idea, as is Poland. If you go back in the 1700s, the Poland rulers held sway all the way over to Kiev. Ukraine was culturally tied into Russia. You have a picture of Yaroslav the Elder establishing monasteries in Kiev. When we took a trip up the Volga, we stopped in a city called Yaroslav. There was a much more strong resemblance between the thoughts of the Ukrainian people and the Russian people
Robert,
at large.
I'm going to cut you off for a moment there. If you read Putin's manifesto, you'll see exactly what Robert is talking about, because he lays out the history going back to the founding of Kiev by the Rus and how that all changed. The reason I'm interrupting you is I don't want to go down that train with, you raised another very interesting point, and that is, should NATO as an organization play a role? As an organization, this is very different from having individual European states in the EU get involved in the mix. as opposed to NATO. Now, I'm just going to bring up this one point. Article 5 of the NATO Charter basically says, I'm simplifying it, an attack on one is an attack on all, and requires a response. It doesn't necessarily say go to war, but it requires a response from all those involved. And who joined NATO very recently?
Sweden and Finland.
Exactly. So you're Russia, having fought this war now, we're going to hit 4 years in February with enormous cost, great distortion of your economy, a lousy demographic. Are you going to invade Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania when you've got all of NATO countries involved by that action? That would be, now I'm not saying he's not capable of it, but I got to give the guy a little bit of credit. I don't believe he's that stupid. Now, what he has said is if Russia is threatened with its own destruction, we're going to take everybody with us. And just recently, you can look these up, Russia launched a missile which they said is nuclear powered, can fly 14,000 kilometers, I think it is, but maybe it's miles, I'd have to check it out. And they have another new weapon they call the Poseidon. These are very interesting because they represent different kinds of threats that basically would lead to mutually assured destruction. Now the question is, what trigger? If NATO gets involved as an institution supporting Ukraine, as opposed to independent states, not only has NATO breached its charter, because it has no authority, it's supposed to be a defensive alliance solely. Then you've breached a whole new barrier. If individual states decide to participate, that does raise issues, but it's a different set of issues from an institution doing it. Now, how about the UN playing a role? Anyone? Greg, hold off. Yes.
I want to go back to your data business.
Okay.
And know whether Russia was crazy enough to invade Estonia or whatever.
Well, there was invasion of Poland's airspace
Yes.
recently. There was invasion, I think, of Estonia's airspace
Yes.
recently. So maybe he's not quite that crazy, but he seems to be a little losing it.
Well, again, the judgment about those behaviors is a very important one. And that's why I think there needs to be real concern. The question is, do you respond as an independent nation? And that already has been said, I think, by Poland. Said if you have an incursion by a drone or a fighter or a bomber, we're taking it down. You have violated our sovereignty. That doesn't necessarily trigger an all-out war. But remember that what nations tend to do is to push the envelope until they meet enough resistance to say it's not worth the candle. Now, I want to shift. What are your thoughts on Ukraine giving up territory? You may not like it, but I want to know what your thoughts are, because we elect representatives who are going to take part in this kind of negotiation. What would you say to them?
Well, I think Crimea is lost to the Russians.
Okay.
I mean, and I must say, unlike the more recent invasion, taking over Crimea didn't bother me because, as you said, it's 90% Russian to begin with. And it's historically been Russian. It was a gift to Ukraine for God knows what reason. And so that doesn't bother me. And I think we have to accept that.
All
As
right.
far as the other regions, that's a different story.
Well, answer the different story. I mean, that's why we're here.
I have mixed feelings about
Oh,
that.
go ahead, lay it out.
I mean, again, those territories, at least the eastern edge, are largely Russian. Almost everybody in them speaks Russian, and it's a, you know, on the other hand, it's a Sudetenland kind of, you know, if you give it to them, what's next?
And an interesting spin-off on that is that the Ukrainian population that is ethnically identified, linguistically identified as Ukrainian, has largely been displaced, either to Ukraine proper, what remains of it, or to surrounding countries. So to give that territory back becomes a real issue, because a lot of it has been destroyed, right? And if you read some of the articles that are available out there, it's a very interesting issue that once things settle, Russia has already expressed plans to reintroduce a Russian population because they have to resettle all the people that left and went to Russia. So it becomes an interesting dynamic. Anyone else? Does Ukraine have to give up territory? Yes.
I think we simply can't disregard the significance of culture.
Okay, meaning?
Meaning that these people in eastern Ukraine, and I wish I could have a couple of my acquaintances here to talk about it. These people in the eastern part of Ukraine have a deep emotional attachment to Russia and the Russian church.
Yep.
And that counts for something, I think.
Okay.
It's a whisper in their blood.
All right. Now there's a whole series of little levels I want to touch on, again, to ask you all questions about this.
Just
Yes.
one thing. The question is, how much do you stand on principle that you can't invade a country and get territory versus what's practical and what makes sense? And it makes the decision a very difficult one, because I can see the point you're making seems very valid, but then part of me that is very, very rule-based finds it just so distasteful to let that happen.
Let me bring up two segments of that, because I think those are excellent points. First, and again, I'm going to reference this country because it's an important element that is on our media and however you access it fairly frequently. And you'll hear the word used, stolen land, okay? If you came to my lectures in history dealing with the American colonial experience, I flesh it out in a bit more detail. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a perception that the first people occupying land, independent of any other human population occupying that land, you are literally the first people. Does that give you permanent ownership and right to that land? In Canada, just recently, there is an area, I think it's near Vancouver.
Vancouver Island.
There you are. Robert remembers.
No, you gave me what I had to Google to look up.
Well, there you are. Okay. All right. Near Vancouver Island, there's a Native American population that actually never resided there, but they fished there. So they regarded that as their land. Now, go forward 200 years and you now have a modern city there. And the recent decision on the part of the Canadian government was that land belongs to the Native Americans, and you do not own that property in spite of whatever you paid for it. Ooh, interesting. Yep. And everywhere else. So when we think about it, from the standpoint of legitimacy, how do you draw that line? I would say you can't. So the question becomes, goes back to that old argument, possession is 9/10 of the law. If the Ukrainian population in Lugansk and Donetsk, the region around Mariupol and others near Kherson, Zaporozhye, have all been displaced, now Russians have it, at least under military control. Is it something you can say to Putin, you got to give it all up? And who's going to force him to do it?
Winner.
And who's going to be the winner? Ukraine? Does Ukraine have the military capacity to throw Russia out? Now, just recently, and again, I offer this to you as an interesting exercise. There's a site called Rumble, R-U-M-B-L-E, and in it, there's a person who blogs twice a day on what's going on in Ukraine in the conflict. And he'll occasionally rope in some political stuff. And he will use examples to show who occupies what. And this has gone on since 2022. Now, I don't follow it every day, but I follow it fairly frequently. And what has been interesting in the last several weeks is that Russia has made advances which Ukraine is struggling to stop. And there are a couple different pockets forming on that conflict line that really threaten Ukraine with considerable loss. So the question is, how could Ukraine possibly throw the Russians out? Yes?
Economics.
Ukraine has the economic wherewithal? Okay.
The United States.
Okay.
And the pressure we can bring to bear on people that are going to hurt Russia.
Give me an example.
India.
Okay. Putting tariffs on India. Right? Okay. And, Robert, we won't go down the road of tariffs just yet. Hold on. Hold on.
I was just going to ask about the tariffs on Russia.
Yes.
Zilch.
All right, so we have, it's not zilch, we have sanctions. They're a little different because we don't get anything much from Russia. But here's an interesting side note. Up until recently, and I don't think I'm even wrong saying up until today, Germany still has imported a large amount of oil and gas from Russia. They're paying the Russians billions of dollars.
But we'll push the Indians harder because they're part of the great unwashed.
That's an interesting comment, and I appreciate you making it in just that way. That's an interesting approach. Now, what about China, which also is buying a large amount of oil at a discount from Russia? What do you do with them?
We need their rare earth.
Right now, and they need our soybeans, or if we don't sell, as Robert pointed out at another session, we need to sell soybeans. The recent agreement was 25 million tons. Think about that number.
$10 a bushel.
To go up to 50 million tons in the coming years. So, what do we say? We're going to stop getting our rare earth metals from you until we develop other sources? Are we going to punish our farmers who have been growing soybeans? Frankly, soy is okay and a little bit for me, but I'm just not a huge fan. So are you going to go out and buy soy products that our farmers are cluttering up your grocery store with? Wait a minute. Because, I know, but I want to let other people weigh in who've maybe been reticent. I don't want you to feel reticent. This is open. Yes?
getting back to the territory.
Yes,
I think between Ukraine and Russia, that ultimately will happen. But the consequences for the long term, Putin can't be trusted. He's going to sign an agreement, I'll take back X, Y, and Z, or keep X, Y, and Z, and I promise not to do anything until I decide to break my promise.
good for you. So that's this last issue. How do you guarantee Ukraine's security regardless of whether they've given up territory or not? Let's assume for the moment that the conflict somehow ends. And you're quite right. How do you trust anybody? What security guarantees can be offered to Ukraine? Anybody? Yes.
Membership in NATO. You
Okay.
can only guarantee that with teeth.
Okay. Anyone else? Jerry?
Have we not learned anything from history?
So how would you guarantee their security?
Have we not learned anything from history? What did Hitler say? I'll only take,
Right.
and then I'll stop and I won't do anything else.
Right.
And, when are we gonna learn?
Okay, so now tell me how you guarantee their security or what your thoughts are. Yes.
I don't, we guaranteed their security once when they gave up their nuclear weapons. And right now, the only thing that makes sense to me is having Western troops in the Ukraine to guarantee it. And that way we would have to respond if Russia did something. I don't want to put Western troops in, I don't want to put European troops or American troops there. But it's hard to imagine anything else that would work.
Okay, I think that's a good question, but now I'm going to make it a little more personal. Should America put troops in Ukraine?
Let's take a look at that last point and restate it as, how is the integrity of the final settlement guaranteed? What guarantees are given to Russia that they won't suffer untoward consequences?
Okay, so it's a yin and a yang from what I'm hearing, Tom, is that you not only offer security guarantees to Ukraine, but you offer them to Russia, all right? So let's flesh this out. First, should America, the United States, have troops in Ukraine provided we at least have a treaty like the Minsk Accord that said the borders are going to be respected even though we don't trust you? Should American troops be in Ukraine? That's part of the question that our administrations all the way through have had to deal with. Is the answer yes or no? Is there any feelings about that? Yes.
No.
Okay.
I adopt the Chinese model. Economically far more effective and for long lasting.
Okay. So without troops, all right, as Jerry pointed out, as Greg has pointed out, those are just pieces of paper, right? The same thing that happened with World War I and happened with World War II. You're going to go to war over a piece of paper? Any other thoughts on how to secure Ukraine's?
Another example, I think, is the Korean War. And the way that was settled, obviously we had military involvement there.
Right.
So we already had troops. But to this day, they've remained there. And they remained there not so much for their defensive capability as to act as a speed bump, really. So if North Korea decides to come over the board, that obviously triggers a response. Right. That's more than a sheet of paper.
That's an excellent point. And that actually brings me to the next question. Because Who were the combatants in the Korean War?
It's pretty much the US and Russia.
Yeah, but who else was
And
there
China as well,
besides the
yeah.
US and North Korea and China? Russia had some work with the Air Force, but they didn't have troops on the ground. They may have had pilots in the sky, but they didn't have troops on the ground. The Chinese did. Who else was there alongside the ROK and the US? Who else?
Australia, Canada, Japan.
How did they get there? Through what organization? Through the UN. So now we ask ourselves, how did that come about that the UN agreed to have a military force? Go ahead.
Russia boycotted the meeting, and that's the last time they ever did that.
Exactly. So now we have an interesting problem. What is the role of the UN in settling this? In other words, you can't send a UN force the way you did or we did in Korea, because Russia will never permit it, nor would China, for that matter, which is also on the Security Council, all right? So the question is, what about UN peacekeeping forces? Now again, when I have the session on UN, I'll bring this up in more detail, but go ahead. Come on. That means you're thinking. Say something. Does the UN have a role? Okay, so in one sense, we're saying the UN is incapable through its own legal structure, but through its own lack of will to be a participant, right? Where have we seen anything come out of the UN about this particular conflict? Other than to say, you know, you guys stop fighting, right? Yeah, stop fighting. It's like two kids banging each other up and you just stop it. So if the UN, yes, go ahead.
It's a slightly different one.
Go ahead, no, by all means.
Other than some cultural paranoia, I'm not sure why Putin feels insecure and that he needs assurances. When the Soviet Union dissolved and there was a westernization of Russia with Yeltsin, particularly economically, it seemed like they didn't have to beat us, they could join us. They would become more like the rest of the world.
Right.
And unless you were a dictator who wanted to have absolute power, I don't see how the country's integrity was threatened by that direction or that growth.
You raise an interesting point. I'm only going to bring out one historical feature related to that. And that during that time of collapse, the issue was to look at where NATO countries were. Who belonged to NATO, who didn't, right? Because Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on and so forth, you know, Yugoslavia with all its iterations and so on, all that Balkan area didn't belong to NATO, okay? Now they do. Most of them do. Balkan's still screwy, but the point is.
He answered his own question, cultural paranoia.
Right. There's a good part, but there's also the military paranoia because NATO has moved east. Why, as a defensive organization created initially to protect what was known as Western Europe from the USSR. And remember, NATO was formed before the Warsaw Pact. I don't know if you're aware of that. So the issue is, NATO's moved east. Oh yeah, they're a defensive alliance. Oh yeah, that's what they say. But they have military and economic power that far exceeds ours. That means we're at best a junior partner. And our history, going back into the 1700s, has been, and actually even before that, that the West has invaded us, not the other way around. So, historical and cultural and military, are part of the reason for this paranoia. So I think Russia has to be given some sense that, as was offered here in one of the slides, that Ukraine not join NATO. For Russia, that might be truly a bridge too far. Okay? Yes, Greg.
Would Finland and Sweden have joined NATO if Putin had stayed out of Ukraine? No. If Putin is has paranoia, he gave it to himself.
Well, we can blame him all we like, but that's not where we're going with the discussion. The discussion is to try to formulate two elements. One, if the conflict is resolved, what is the role of the United States in particular? Because it evolves into our national security interests. And how does our participation become moderated? So as our representatives get into this discourse, we can weigh in with some degree of understanding of what we really expect. Otherwise, we can just be passive and turn it all over to them and just say, you guys know more than I do, so you'll figure out what's best. Yeah, we've seen that work, right? Okay. But yes, Robert, you were, oh.
One point hasn't been mentioned yet is the perception of Ukraine vis-a-vis the Russians. The Russians replaced the old Soviet Union. In the mid-30s, the Soviet Union starved systematically the Ukraine territory, and they remember.
Yeah, it's called the Holodomor. And there are millions who starved to death under Stalin's rule. There were a lot of different issues involved with that at the time, but it was a destruction perpetrated by the Moscow government, basically, against the Ukrainian people. And it was enormously destructive. And if you talk to Ukrainians, and I know a few, you know, Russia's not their older brother, much as Putin might like to say that, okay? As far as they're concerned, they want nothing to do with those guys. So here we have a bitter conflict with a different perception of your national identity as a Ukrainian versus your national identity as a Russian. Now, I mention this because I alluded to it earlier, and that was the UN actions to do something about the war, resolutions, statements, investigations, humanitarian and relief support. That goes to Ukraine. I haven't seen of anything going to Russia. Barriers, we already talked about. Security Council veto. Political divisions within the General Assembly of UN. If you need to see an example of that, just look at the resolutions coming out regarding Israel and Gaza. Non-binding nature of resolutions, conflicting interests, and how do you implement and enforce? And that's where I alluded to the idea that if the conflict were somehow to at least create a ceasefire, whether it's a DMZ a la Korea or something else, in this situation, does the UN play a role by having peacekeepers there? And what is the history of peacekeeping operations for the UN in various countries? And I would argue it's a mixed bag. But it's something Russia might agree to. And China might agree to it.
So are we going to have the Korean-style DMZ or the Vietnam-style DMZ?
Again, the question is, what style of DMZ? Which is, again, getting into the nuts and bolts. And who's going to man it? Who's going to back it up? Who's going to say this is inviolable territory? Remember, we had a DMZ across the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, right? We had a DMZ. You don't cross this line. Seemed to work for a good while, right?
No escape.
Well, depends on where you want to go. Is that feasible? Is there anyone who would argue that is just, pardon me, Greg, just a bad idea? Or not? Is that actually a great idea? It'll take a lot to build it, but once it's in place, it becomes very hard to challenge that wall. I say that with a big W and a little w. Okay. I bring this up because it's going to be addressed again, but I just want to go over it very quickly in terms of case studies of effective UN peacekeeping. They did do some things that worked. As you'll see in Liberia, Sierra Leone, even in Cambodia, they helped restore governments, get some stability politically within an area, but these were not necessarily always a threat from the outside. They were internal threats, okay? So they brought in peacekeepers. There's a great little movie, by the way, if any of you have Netflix and you're okay with seeing a military movie, it's called The Siege of Jadotville, Jadotville. Takes place in a place called Katanga, and it's a UN peacekeeping mission. And what happens back in the day of Dag Hammarskjöld. In fact, he was flying there when his plane crashed, okay? In the movie, they make it a little more dramatic than his plane crashed. They think it was shot down. Failed or limited, Rwanda, Bosnia, Mali. If you look at Bosnia in detail, what happened in the Balkans when the fighting broke out was enormously complex because Serbia and Croatia got very much involved with Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it became a very, I'll call it international conflict. Very destructive. And in fact, Sarajevo was under siege longer than Leningrad, as an example. Mali right now is collapsing. And again, this will be addressed through one of my Substack postings. But right now, the government of Mali is struggling to maintain itself at all under jihadist action. And it's truly jihadist because that's how they identify themselves. That's not my term, that's their term. So now we come to this. Here it is, coming up on 4 years. Remember that the Eastern Front from June 22nd of 41 to when the Germans surrendered on May 5th, 45, 4 years. The Russians were in Berlin. The Soviets were in Berlin. We're 4 years in. What do we do now? Any thoughts? Yes?
We starve Russia.
Starve them in resources, food.
Don't use it with war. You don't send people in.
Right.
You do the Chinese thing.
Right. Okay. And we already talked a little bit about that in terms of cutting off India by raising tariffs and have them stop importing oil and gas.
And others.
So if we were to do that to India.
Because, excuse me 1 second.
Yes.
Because that gives Putin a way to declare victory.
Right. And we had alluded to that before in terms of what even Trump has said, you both want. Yes.
Peace prize.
Oh, are we done?
A break time, I guess, in the middle.
Oh.
Provided that
No, I mean, sorry, your bladder might be full by now. Sorry, it just kept going. By all means, let's take, what do you want, 5-minute break, just to stretch your legs and get your thoughts in order. But I do want to I just want to emphasize to all of you, please, you know, you're thinking individuals and you're involved whether you like it or not by having to decide who your representatives are, what influence, if any, you can bring to the administration. I think writing letters to the UN isn't going to work. Or to the head of NATO. I just don't think he's going to listen to us. Well, it's not a matter of that. It's a matter, remember, this started back in 2022, and issues actually started back in 2014. So to point to this administration as somehow culpable is not interpreting history correctly. However, if what you think this administration is doing is just far off the rails, then you should be able to speak up about that either here or to your representatives. So we'll take a 5-minute break. Do you want to stop recording for 5 minutes or just let it go? Yes, that's happened before.
But our government is Venezuela, then we can sponsor the oil.
Well, no, there's a difference between what we're reading about, because remember, we're getting information from different sources that have different ideologies behind them, different agendas behind them. And again, just to draw a parallel, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but this is the story. You may remember Trump's State of the Union address that he did shortly after inauguration. Basically said, I could cure cancer, and you still would blame me for something, side effects or whatever. The point being, that's not where we are, all right? What we look at is to say, is there any consistency? And if not, how do I object to that? And what do I see as my avenue? So you could write to Schumer, you could write to Gillibrand, you could write to anyone, even to the administration, and say, you're on the wrong path here. I think we should do what you've said. Now, he's already started that threat, right, with India. But now take India as an example. You're the Indian premier, and Trump says, I'm going to do this if you keep buying Russian oil and gas. How am I going to fuel my economy? Where am I going to get oil and gas? So we say in return, we're going to offer this, and we'll start shipping it over as soon as you agree to cut off. Well, right. But there are a number of different issues involved there as well. And this comes down to, again, to national security interests, all right? You can look at it and say, we need friends. Do nations have friends? Or do they have relationships? And do relationships depend upon the balance of interests of the two? So I'll give you just one quick example. Do the European countries, Germany in particular, have an interest in protecting themselves with a reasonable military force? Do you think, given what's gone on in Ukraine, that Germany should be stepping up, at least in its own defense, militarily? Do you think they should or not? No, give me the visceral reaction.
In terms of economic. So we've had all this fire and
Yes, intellectually, I think yes, they should.
Okay, now, we're not saying what they're going to do with a force. We're going to say it's a defense force. Do you know what the status of their defense force is right now? It's an out-and-out disaster. Oh, it is awful. Just recently, they published information that they were down many thousands of recruits to their military, and that's been ongoing for years. The number of aircraft they have that are combat ready, 1 squadron. They have no particular shipping other than defense, other than coastal. They have very few tanks. They have very little training in helicopters. They actually had to requisition civilian helicopters to train pilots. That's how bad it is. And again, I think the answers there are both yes and no. You can't cut it off and expect anything to happen. What has been Germany's investment in energy sources up till recently? What has been their primary motivation? Renewables. Renewables are insufficient to run their, no, they've been very anti-nuclear. France has a lot of nuclear, but not Germany. So Germany no longer really mines much coal, which was the primary use during World War I and II. So they became dependent on oil and gas. Do they have oil and gas in Germany? No. So you begin to see the ramifications. If you cut them off right like that, their economy dies. They're already in trouble. So we would have to gear up. Now, if we're going to support India and we're going to support Germany, that's a huge amount of energy, right? So why would we do that if Germany isn't willing to defend itself? Okay? But why is it our best interest? Now, I'm not disagreeing, but I want you to flesh that out. No, it's okay. Now that's an interesting point to make. I would disagree with you on a personal level, but that is one of the principles that other people have brought up. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. That's a perfect segue into here. No, that's great. That's really, really excellent. To answer your question, in reference to Japan as an example, that Japan is seeing a threat from China, somewhat from North Korea, because North Korea is getting technology on their missiles, which may allow them to do independently re-entry of different warheads off one missile. That represents a huge threat to Japan. For the first time in recent history, Japan is building up its military and shifting slightly from a purely defensive posture to a more balanced posture where they have some offensive capability. Because China. And we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. So, you see, so your point's an excellent one. Let me gather people back. Oh, right. And so a weak Russia. Excellent. I have liked seeing all of you talking among each other. I hope you weren't just talking about the upcoming election on Tuesday. But one of the discussions we just had, and a very interesting point was raised. And I think this is often strikes at the heart of something which relates to our national interests in particular. Do we want a weak Russia? Anybody? No. Okay, why not? Go ahead. We need the microphones. Where are they?
We would like a credible buffer to China.
Okay, that's a good point.
Depends on who's in charge.
A weak Russia's more likely to be aggressive.
Okay, that's an interesting spinoff. Robert, you were going to say something?
I was going to echo her point. They will still retain nuclear weapons. The weaker they get, the more inclined they will be to use them. One point that hasn't been raised yet is the pathetically weak showing that the Russian army made. They should have been able to take Ukraine like a speed bump, and they have been bogged down going on for years.
Okay, take that microphone away from him. You make a very interesting point. There's a whole set of reasons. When you look at what happened in the initial stage of Russia's invasion, that I won't go into, but basically the problem was they believed their own narrative. They were much less capable than the administration was being told. Much less capable. And I won't go into details. There's a whole lot related to that we need not discuss. Let's go back to the issue, though, of let's suppose Russia is teased away from its relationship with China and more closely integrated into Europe. Would that be a good outcome?
Culturally, Russia is not European.
Okay. Yes.
I don't think it would make much difference to the United States, but it would certainly be a blow to the egos of Germany, France, Great Britain, and the other basket cases in Western Europe.
Okay. What support are we seeing for Ukraine coming from France and Germany and Italy? Anybody? Yes.
Germany has sent tanks.
Right.
Poland sent an air force. France and Italy are stomping grapes.
And as it turns out, the German tanks that they've sent, and England has sent some as well, the German tank stock, that is the number of tanks they possessed before sending, was already well below what most nations would indicate as a credible military force. We were talking about that during the break. Germany's military structure was so deficient that they literally had to hire civilian helicopters to train pilots. They had one squadron of combat-ready aircraft. One squadron. They have no blue water navy at all. They simply have a coastal one. So there are thousands below recruitment. So having shipped, well, I'm sorry, say it.
And the rest of Western Europe likes that.
Exactly. So the issues that we're looking at is that Germany, which is closer to the front line with Ukraine than we are, has demonstrated no particular interest in aiding Ukraine in any significant fashion, and is not even willing to really defend itself because they don't think the Russians will ever get there. So what's the need for it? I'm sorry?
And is economically tied to Russia.
Yes, by fuel and oil, and their economy is struggling as well because of it. Their emphasis, and they will admit this, on renewables has cut into their energy sources. And if you look at the cost of energy in Germany compared to here, they're paying 3 times plus what we pay per kilowatt hour. So it's just an example of things. Now, I want to hit this one. What actions should be taken if Ukraine faces utter collapse? They're going under. Their armed forces are wrecked beyond appropriate ability to resist. And now the Russians have not only taken Kharkiv, but they're approaching Kiev. Anything should be done at that point? You have to look at the worst case scenario. What happens? Remember, World War I was a static war on the Western Front for years until 1918. Then things collapsed. Why wouldn't that happen here?
Lend-Lease.
Well, Lend-Lease did not exist in World War I, not in that sense.
I mean, we'll do Lend-Lease for the Ukrainians.
All right, but the Ukrainians need people. Their population is less than 1/3
Right.
the population of Russia.
Less than 1/4.
All right? And their economy, their GDP, is roughly 1/10, 200+ billion compared to 2 trillion. So, Russian forces are now advancing on Kiev. What actions do we take? Lend-Lease is not going to cut it. They just don't have the manpower, and you can't get enough weapons there for a force that's collapsing. What do?
Mike, is there some way, this is like a fairy tale, that something could happen within the with the Russians themselves? We had a very little prick happen.
Right.
And if that could happen with the fellow who was, put in jail for years and died slowly.
Right.
Or is it just a dream?
No, you raise an interesting point, but I'm going to throw it back to you in this regard. If you're winning, why would you take out the guy that's coaching your team?
Well, it seems that the Russian people are not unhappy.
No, they're not right now. But if they're going to take all of Ukraine, are they going to go shoot Putin?
Yeah.
You're winning. You've expended all this treasure and blood, and now you're winning. What is the West going to do? Well, that's why I'm asking it. I don't have the answer. Yes.
I think the answer is nothing. And the reason it's nothing, to be honest with you, it's right in front of us. There's two things. If prevention is worth an old ounce of cure, and if we were wanting Russia not to be in Kiev, we'd be giving weapons a year ago. We're not going to do it when Russia is crossing the threshold. Too late. And the other thing is, and I'm just going to inject this because I think it's unavoidable, is this is presuming this abstract discussion that we have a president that is some kind of disinterested participant in the process of trying to resolve this conflict. And with all due respect, it's in our face that Russia has some undue influence over our president, who is not an advocate for our interest in this conflict.
Okay, I'm going to, wait a minute. No, don't go down that road, people. That distorts the nature of this discussion, and I don't want to have it, all right? I don't mind in your own mind if you condemn this administration. I don't mind in your own mind if you challenge what influence Putin may have with the current President Trump or not. That's not the question before us. The question before us is simply this. If Russia continues to make significant gains, I think your initial question, your answer was appropriate. We will do nothing. Is that the only response possible? And if it's not, what else do we do? Yes.
Well, to me, it seems like that there are two reasonable or likely reactions. One, the reaction of Britain and France after the invasion of Poland in 39, or the US reaction after the fall of France in 40. I mean, either you do nothing, which I think is, the man's correct, we probably do nothing,
Right.
or the other is to mount a force.
Okay. Yes.
I don't know if you covered it, but what was the Biden administration's objectives for arming Ukraine in February 2022? And maybe if we knew what the Biden administration's objectives were, we would know what to do if it collapsed.
That's an interesting point. I didn't go into a lot of that because I try to steer clear of targeting or appearing to target any particular administration's decisions. That's not what I wanted this session to be like. But what I can answer in very superficial terms is that the interest expressed by the Biden administration, by President Biden himself, at one particular point was once the conflict broke out, he wanted to see regime change, and he stated that in one of his addresses. Now, you can go back further and ask what happened in 2014 with our administration then, which was then under President Obama, and what did we do about the invasion of Crimea? And then you can look at the first Trump administration from 2017 to January of 2021 and ask, what did they do? The one difference between those two administrations was that the Trump administration sent weapons to Ukraine, hoping that they would be able to stifle the Russian incursion. The Biden administration did not take that approach initially until it was clear how bad the conflict was. But if you go back further to Crimea, the only support that the Obama administration offered to Ukraine, because the separatist movement has started, and there's considerable fighting on the eastern border of Ukraine, was only what we designated as humanitarian aid. So that's the problem with asking what were their objectives. Circumstances were different 10 years ago, different 5 years ago, different now. And they're changing almost daily, at least weekly, because Trump said, I'm not going to meet with Putin. I'm not going to meet with him. Enough is enough. So those are different issues that we have to be alert to. Yes, Robert.
Putin said, how can you cancel a meeting that was never set?
Well, again, you're getting into a different dynamic that I don't want to go down, because that begins to charge people's emotions, and I'm not trying to engage that. I'm trying to get us to sit back and think, what would you do? What if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons? That's been threatened. Under what circumstances? I don't know. I can't get into that guy's head.
Against who?
Ukraine.
Okay.
Not to use against anyone else. That's the problem. If he uses it only in Ukraine, what's our response? Do we nuke Russia?
I have a question. It's my understanding in the beginning of this conflict that Ukraine had they could only attack in their country. They couldn't go over the border. But isn't it now allowed that it's acceptable to go further and further into the Russia territories?
Well, you raise an interesting point. Those are the restrictions that were put on weapons that were sent that had the particular range. And that is one of the things that the Biden administration and the Trump administration have given some tacit approval to striking into Russia. But Ukraine is manufacturing some rather sophisticated weapons on their own. The reason, as I understand it, that Trump would not permit Tomahawk missiles to be given to Ukraine, there are different arguments for and against, but I'll put it in this context, because those have a range and an accuracy that is really a challenge to Russia. How do you defeat them coming in? And their targeting is so precise that it can be a real challenge. That represents an increase in the threat level. Yes?
I think Russia has two areas of weakness. One is their economy,
right,
and the other is the homeland. The homeland, threats to the homeland.
Okay.
If Ukraine begins to collapse, I think we can go to Putin and say, let's make a deal. If you're not willing to make a deal about limited territory, we will release the notion of attacks to the homeland, and we can do this and this and this and this to drain your economy further and further and further.
Right.
That may be a longer game to play,
right,
but it may be the more successful of the two.
One of the interesting elements, and we're going to conclude because it's 3 o'clock and you people have been extraordinarily patient, is to remember that in a lot of previous conflicts, different attempts were made to destroy an opponent's economy. One easy example to use is World War II with strategic bombing in Germany and Japan. The targets destroy the economy, the countries will be forced to quit. Did that happen? No. So while this is not I'm not trivializing it. What I'm saying is that modern nations have enormous depth of resources. And if you generally have your population behind you, you can weather an enormous amount of damage. So look at Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, Cologne, any of the German cities there. Go look at Tokyo, go look at Yokohama, go look at all those different places that were targeted. And I'm excluding Nagasaki and Hiroshima for a different reason. The quitting there wasn't because their economy was wrecked. They quit because there was annihilation on the table. Complete and utter annihilation. So I thank you for your participation. I appreciate it. If you wish to contact me privately, my email is very simple, mbagdasarian@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to respond to anything. Thank you again. I hope to see you in 2 weeks.